Was this something people actually did? Or was it just something that we watched on television as kids growing up and we just thought everyone did this? Did you ever spit in your own hand and have your friends spit in their hand and then you shook hands and you made some kind of oath, some kind of promise to one another, maybe to be best friends forever? Or this is even crazier, but cutting their hands open and becoming blood brothers. I never did that. Thinking back, I don't think I ever even tried, but I definitely do remember seeing that kind of stuff on television. There's something pretty fascinating when you think about it though. This idea of whether it's your spit or it's your blood, it's something that's mine. It's unique to me, and you have something that's unique to you. But then we open up or we spit on our hands and then we shake hands, and now what's unique to me and what's unique to you now becomes one thing. And it's this idea that now we have a bond, this promise that goes beyond just mere words. It's a significant milestone that's been set up. And we see this early on with God. He sets up a covenant with man, and it starts at the very beginning with Adam and Eve when they sin and they fall for all mankind. It creates this chasm and this separation between man and God. Thankfully for us, God already had a plan set in place if need be. And there's a moment where he's talking to the serpent after the fall. He's talking to Eve and he's talking to Adam. He says to the serpent, he says that this woman's descendants, he's going to bruise your head and you will bruise only his heel. And right there in that moment, I don't know if it's the Adamic covenant. I know that's what it's been called, but I don't know if it's necessarily a covenant. But we do know that that's a moment where God flashes his cards for a second and shows his grand plan for all of humanity in the history of the world. So before we get into this idea of covenant and how it spans and covers all of history, first let's establish what is a covenant. Well, Vine's Complete Expository Dictionary explains it this way. The most common verb is karath, which is the Hebrew word to cut a covenant. So when we see in Genesis 15 that God makes a covenant with Abraham, he actually cuts a covenant. This whole idea of cut comes from this story. And so God comes to Abram and says, I have some great promises for your future. I have great gifts for you. And Abram looks at God and says, I don't even have offspring. And God says, I have a future plan for you and your descendants. He says, all the promises will be for the offspring of my household. And God says, no, you will have a son. He says, and then he takes Abram out into the night sky. He points up to the heavens. He says, do you see the stars? As if you could even count them all. Your descendants will be like this, more numerous than the stars in the heavens. Abram boldly returns to God with this comment, what assurance do I have of this promise? How do I even know it will come to pass? God, in his mercy, doesn't use his big, bold voice. He doesn't confront Abram for his faithlessness, but instead, he says, do this. Go and get me a heifer. Go and get me a female goat. Go and get me an ox. Go and get me a turtle dove and a young pigeon. And according to tradition in the Hebrew way, Abram pulled all this together and then he cut them as they would do. And he separate the pieces and put one column this way and another this way. And what they would do in the time is they would pass, when there's a covenant made, that there's a promise that there will be something to fulfill between two parties. Both parties would pass between the pieces. But we don't see this. We only see God passing through the pieces. And in that, the whole idea, the concept that's wrapped around this is that whoever passes between the pieces is basically saying this: if I fail on my promise, if I fail to do what I've said, if I fail on this covenant, then it is that I will die and I will be accursed and I shall be ripped apart just the same as these sacrifices have been. And this is a fascinating thing when it comes to what God is going to promise for us in this new covenant. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, let's take a look. There's a few things I want to look at. The covenant as personal, the covenant as universal, and the covenant as relational. And let's not be mistaken, relational and personal, they're not the same thing here. And so we see that God establishes his covenants with multiple men throughout the Pentateuch and even into the Old Testament. And so first we see he establishes his covenant with Noah. He establishes covenant with Abraham. He establishes a covenant with Moses. And then he moves on out of the Pentateuch. He establishes a covenant with David. And so it's this very personal covenant, a promise from God to an individual. With Noah in Genesis 6:18 says, I will establish my covenant with you. For Abraham in Genesis 17:2 it says that I will make my covenant between me and you. It's very personal. Moses, he says, write these words, for in accordance with these words I have made my covenant with you and with Israel. In 2 Samuel 7:16, God makes a covenant with David, and he makes it very personal. He says, and your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. But these covenants were not just made for the individual. They were not made just to be personal. God does make these personal covenants and promises to these men and these individuals, but then he opens them up even wider. We see with Noah, God moves even further. He says, this is a sign of my covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. With Abraham, he says, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all families of the earth shall be blessed. For Moses, it's write these words, for in accordance with these words I have made my covenant with you and Israel. And so we see that there's this pattern that God has set up with covenant. So he makes this personal promise to the individual of what he's going to do, that it's between God and them. Then he says, but it's not just for you, it's going to extend beyond you for all mankind. And there's a pattern within these covenants that God adheres to every time. First, he always makes some kind of promise. Then he has some kind of condition that he asks them to hold up to. And then he establishes a sign or even just a seal of his promise and what he's going to do. And so we see with these promises for Noah, it's that I establish this promise to you. There will never be a flood that wipes out humanity like you've seen in this event. I promise this will never happen again. With Abraham, it's the blessing for all generations. He will bless the generations. Moses, it's that he's going to establish God's people. And then with David, it's David's descendants will be on the throne. These are the promises that he is making. The conditions that he establishes with these men. For Noah, it's an unconditional covenant that he makes. He doesn't ask for anything in return. He just says, I promise you that I will never do this again. To Abraham, he says, just walk blamelessly before me. Moses, obey my law. And David, remain faithful to me and establish your descendants to do the same. And so he then put these signs in place to seal these promises that he made with these men. And he said, so with Noah, we know that he throws a rainbow up in the sky. And he does this so that we can remember always that this event will not occur. And so K.A. Matthews says it like this. He says, the bow functioned as a visible token of God's invisible word of grace. With Abraham, it's circumcision that he's sealing this promise by saying, I'm going to set you apart. With Moses, it's the Sabbath. And then with David, it's the sign and seal is actually in his own son Solomon, showing that his descendants are walking with God. And so that's the promise to David that his lineage will continue serving the Lord just as he did. The covenant is both personal and universal. God makes a personal promise to these men, having a connection with them, and then he takes that to a universal place, saying that this will be something I'm establishing with all of humanity. It's good for us to look back at the old covenants that he's established with these men in the Old Testament, because we can then recognize these patterns that he's put within his covenants, because those same patterns are in this new covenant that he has established with us. Victor Hamilton explains, the purpose of covenant is to create a new relationship. I'm really glad that we don't serve a God who is just some far-off deity who created the heavens and the earth and put them into motion and then went off to do whatever else he needed to do. No, he's relational. He desires relationship with us. We see this with Abram in Genesis chapter 15, like we were talking about earlier. God is establishing this relationship and this covenant with Abram, and it gets to the place where he's cut these sacrifices into two pieces, and this is a moment where you pass through, and so John M. McDermott tells us this: God reconciles us with with God's own self. It is the relationship between God and the human creature which is the primary objective of this act of divine grace. If you remember before when we were talking about the Vine's dictionary and its description of the karath, this Hebrew word to cut a covenant, it goes on to say this, that the verb makes it plain that God takes the sole initiative in covenant making and fulfillment. And so as God is passing between the two pieces, we don't see Abram pass between these two pieces. And that was intentional because God is both the covenant maker and the covenant fulfiller. And so God says to Abram, I am making this covenant promise for the both of us. Because if one of us were to fail this, it would be like we are to die just like these animals have. And we should be torn apart just as they have. And we will be accursed just as they are. And I will tell you this, Abram, I will not break my promise. This will never happen to me. I am God. But for you, Abram, it most assuredly will happen. You will break my covenant. You will break this covenant you will make with me. And you will then die and you will be accursed. And I can't have that. So I'm going to pass between these pieces for the both of us. And so we see how this moves forward into this new covenant that he's going to establish from the very beginning. It's been woven in throughout the Old Testament, from covenant to covenant to covenant, until we get to Jesus, who comes in the flesh, because he's to be the perfect lamb, the perfect sacrificial lamb. Because God says, I'm going to take this upon myself. I know, Abram, that you are going to break our promise. And so God says, I'm not going to allow this to happen. I will not let you die. I will not let you be accursed. I'm going to take it upon myself. And so he sends Jesus to die as a perfect sacrificial lamb. He will be torn apart. He will shed his blood for us. He will take on the curse for us so that we don't have to die, and so we don't have to live separated for all of eternity from him. And we see in Hebrews 8:6 that Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old as the covenant he mandates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. And then Hebrews 9:26, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Then we have the terms of this new covenant that follows the same pattern as the old one, that there's promises, that there's conditions, and that there's a sign. And so the promise is this. Grant R. Osborne says it this way, that the Old Testament, as declaring even in Abraham's time that God's clear purpose was the evangelization of all humankind through his chosen people. The New Testament described and explained the redemptive act of Christ on the cross as a central point of history and prepared for the final act of salvation history, Christ's return. So we have this promise, like all of history before Jesus was pointing to this moment that he's going to die for us. And all history since Jesus is pointing back to that moment that Jesus died for us. And he created this new covenant with his blood. He was the perfect sacrificial lamb on our behalf. Then it comes with a condition, a simple condition. Just believe. Believe that Jesus did that he is the Son of God, that he died for our sins, and that he went to the grave and rose again 3 days later. And fulfilling the promise and covenant that God made with David, he's now ascended and he's on the throne as king forever. And it comes with this sign. God says, I'll give you a sign with this new covenant. It's the Holy Spirit, and he will be the indwelling within you. And now we live in this new covenant, a fulfillment of promises of old.